This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today we are going to be discussing The Emperor in August, the 2015 sort of remake of, sort of not remake of the Japan's Longest Day, which came out in the 1960s, and both of them have the Japanese title of Nihon no Ichiban Nagai Hi. And here to discuss this with me is a returning guest, one I am very excited to have back on because it's been a minute since we had him back on, and that is Patrick Terry. Patrick, how you doing?
Doing well. It's good to see you again, Perry. Yeah, it's been a bit of time, but I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Yes, it has been. In fact, I think the last time you were on was even before that we had joined the Film Stories podcast network, and before we had briefly canceled the show and then brought it back. So a lot has happened in that time.
A lot of lifetimes lived, yes.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Before we jump too much into the movie, why don't you remind people about who you are and what you do?
So, I am, in terms of our connection to Japanese film, I am a professor of film at Portland State University. I've been a professor here for, now almost 8 years. And in that time, I primarily teach courses on East Asian cinema, but particularly Japanese cinema based on my research background. Because for my dissertation and doctoral work, I was looking at Japan's film industry from the 1960s to the early 1990s. And a lot of the films, like you just mentioned, like Japan's Longest Day, fit into that first part of what my dissertation was looking at, of changes from what we would think of as a vertically integrated studio system to what we know now, where it takes many, many companies leveraging finances and distribution, that co-production is sort of an understatement with the way films are made now. But we have rare examples like the film we're discussing today of The Emperor in August that gets that prominent shochiku billing. But in terms of like what I am teaching now, I actually am just finishing up a course called War and Memory, and our screening of today was The Emperor in August. So it's just very good timing to be able to, almost like as an epilogue, be able to have this conversation with you and share with my students in the future.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into it. So with your the War and Memory class, that sounds really interesting. What are some of the perspectives that some of the students have come in with in regards to like Japan's aspect in the war, America's aspect in the war, and what are some things that happened to them over the course of the semester? I'm really curious about that because I've kind of gone on my own kind of journey with it, just living in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, I've wanted to teach a course like this for some time. It's sort of a combination of a course I took in my undergraduate days on the Pacific War, but that was in the history department. And then the title, coming from my advisor in my doctorate work, called War and Memory, because he actually wrote a monograph on the colonial empire, and particularly how the empire was made to be attractive. That was the title of his book, Attractive Empire. It was published in 2007. And how Japan's empire tried to promote it as a positive thing, that Korea, Taiwan, Manchukuo would all sort of form this great East Asian empire. And I was very intrigued to be able to delve in this myself because, again, with my studies, I wasn't looking at the war specifically, but over the last number of years and with the geopolitics of today, it felt like the timing to have a course that would engage in films that depict the war, but the other key part of, like you said, the lenses that are used with it. So most of my students are film students, and they come into it with very little Japanese history, politics, or studies background. So there's an aspect of teaching Japan to my students that in a world languages department or a Japanese studies department wouldn't be quite the same. So my students oftentimes come from a Western studies background of the war that starts and ends with Pearl Harbor and the atomic bombing. And so this class was to kind of broaden that scope and look at it in terms of, the different names we might put with it. 15 Years War, the Pacific War, World War II, and how we demarcate all of those elements. And so the course itself is looking at propaganda, excuse me, propaganda films made at the time, like Mud and Soldiers or Five Scouts, but then equally looking at, like I mentioned, something like The Emperor in August or the film Yamato from 2005 to provide a 21st century reshaping of the narrative of how the Pacific War is talked about, both in terms of an apologetic, woeful nation to then an emphasis on militarism and something that would maybe inspire some of the right-wing nationalists of today to again call up the spirit of Japan. So we weren't really trying to lay blame or have any one specific way of interpreting it, but really thinking about how time and different films have reshaped and rethought about this very pivotal point in human history.
Very cool. Sounds really interesting. So now this film, as we mentioned, it is directed by Masato Harada, which I did not know this, but I just found it because literally 5 minutes ago, he played the villain Omura in The Last Samurai, which I had no idea that was the same guy. So that was kind of,
Yep.
my mind was kind of blown by that, and I'm still kind of picking up the pieces just after reading that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
and I know you'd said, obviously for your graduate work and everything, you had talked about, among other films, the original Japan's Longest Day. How did you come to this film in particular, though?
So while I was familiar with the original film, had watched that, my awareness of this film actually happened in Japan at the time that it was being promoted. I was in Japan in 2015 in the summer for a workshop connected to the Kadokawa Corporation and the University of Tokyo. And so I went to I think the Shinjuku Piccadilly Theater, and in there they had, of course, all of the chirashi and films that would be coming out in the next few months. But because it was summertime and this film was going to be released August 8th, they had huge marquees and poster materials sort of set up and things that, like, placards you could stand in front of and take a photo. So when I saw that, I was like, oh my goodness, not only is there a remake, but it has Koji Yakusho, it has Tsutomu Yamazaki, Masahiro Motoki, all of these really big actors that, we've even spoken about, Koji Yakusho and Shall We Dance, just huge actors. And I was so surprised. And then on top of it, to have Masato Harada directing it really was sort of the next sort of factor, because he is a filmmaker equally that has been a part of my cinema journey with Japanese film since my undergraduate days, since, the early 2000s. So it was, again, just sort of prime timing to be aware of it, but it actually was much later before I got to see it, because I didn't have an opportunity at the time to go to the theater and watch it. But it was one that has stayed in my mind for the very reason we're talking, where, there was a film in the 60s, but now we're decades later and we're having a remake of it. What sort of alterations, changes, how is ideologically the war being rethought, and what's the goal of director Harada to want to do a remake like this?
Yeah, and just to be clear as well, Harada himself, he hates calling it a remake. Because he feels like the original was very over the top. And another interesting thing too, which you're aware of, but other viewers may not, other listeners are probably not, is that for the longest time they did not depict the emperor in film. So when they did Japan's Longest Day, they always depicted him like from behind or something like that. They never showed his face. And the first movie who did that came out in Japan was oh, I just had it here. It was The Sun, directed by Alexander Sakharov in 2006. And after they had shown that, after that it became fine then. And so here uh we get to see Hirohito in here, who is played very well, I thought, um, by Masahiro Motoki. Koji Yakusho, like we talked about on um, Shall We Dance, and like I've talked about in other episodes, this guy has become one of my favorite Japanese actors. He's just he's always bringing such a amazing performance, like everything he does. And my history with this film, and I still have not seen Japan's Longest Day, but this is just one of those movies that I stumbled across in one of the video rental stores, which, again, is something that we still have here in Japan.
Mhm.
And I just thought it first off, I love the title here. I think it's such a much more artistic title than just Japan's Longest Day. So The Emperor in August is just such a really striking title. And just based on that, I got curious about it. And at that point, I think I had recently finished reading I'd already read John Dower's book on the occupation, and I'd recently read The Rise and Fall of the Japanese Empire, is I think the title of the book. And so I was curious
Mhm.
to kind of see this then after having just fairly recently read that book. And I really dug it. And I even taught it one semester. I taught it to my students, which is all Japanese students, and it gave them some interesting perspectives, and a little bit different from maybe what they had been indoctrinated to believe was the story about the end of the war. Um, but at the same time, too, rewatching it last night, there are a few thoughts I had about it. First off, I think it's very beautiful. Like, just the way it's shot is there are just
Mm.
some scenes that are just breathtaking, and just the way that Harada shows like a lot of the architecture and the scenery and all that, and even like the tragic scenes, like you see like the bombed out Tokyo and all that. He does a very good job of really setting the scene. It really feels like all of this was shot on location in the 1940s. It's amazing how he did that. Um,
Yeah.
on the other hand, though, there are times I think he lingers a little bit too long. There's one review on Letterboxd that talked about vigorous bicycling, which happens a lot in many scenes here.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I actually had a student make a comment almost exactly that way, that their focus was drawn to the vigorous bicycling through the film.
But overall, I enjoyed it. I thought it was which also kind of surprised me when I saw some of the Letterboxd reviews, because I saw a bunch of negative ones that were um calling it very nationalist, and I
Mhm.
didn't get that impression at all. Um and Harada himself, he says that he didn't set out to make a political movie. I question how true that is, because it feels like there are definitely some choices he made that were coming from a political point of view.
Yeah, I mean, and just the nature of any film that is going to depict these events, and particularly these individuals, is inherently political. I mean, I understand the concept of trying to present it more that there's not maybe an ideological slant in his heart or his mind as he's making it, but the very nature of depicting the events is going to result in, just like you described, kind of these diametrically opposed responses, both to the artistry of the film, but then more specifically, the way in which General Anami is presented, the way that Prime Minister Suzuki, or obviously the Emperor, any depiction of these individuals is going to, release another wave of engagement with both the time being depicted, but also how these individuals symbolize the choices that Japan was making, and I think it also, it just it reveals so much about the audience of how they interpret what they're watching.
Yeah, I think that's very very well said. Uh, and now again, I have not seen Japan's Longest Day, but if I was going to ask you, first off, what's your overall opinion on that movie, and how do you
Mm.
think this one compares to it?
So it is, to me, it is, and this is going to rope back around to a question about you teaching this film to your students, again, within the last number of years that it's been released, because the major striking differences between these films is that Japan's Longest Day is true to both the Japanese and English transliterated title, in that it's a 2 hour and 40-minute film that the first 20 minutes goes from the Potsdam Declaration in July to August 14th, and you spend 2 hours and 20 minutes on the longest day. Whereas Harada, it feels, knows that we are now not 30 years or 20 some years out from the war, in the case of the first version of this, to Harada's version that starts in April after the sinking of the Yamato and covers 4 months of time, of course, giving, preference and more time to, the post Hiroshima bombing. But there's a good deal of time that we are working from April, May, August, or April, May, June into July when the Potsdam Declaration takes place. And that gives a lot more breathing room. And it can be both filled with artistry, but I also feel like it's a little bit like History the movie, teaching the audience the factors that lead to this longest day, that 22 years out from the end of the war, you might not need to do that much shorthand history knowledge to the students. And then, like you mentioned, things like the depiction of the emperor are wildly different. And then the most banal basic is that the original is a black and white feature, where this, of course, has a range of color that's used, and I think feeds into some of the artistic lingerings that you were mentioning before. But that kind of, again, this ropes back around to my question for you of I was teaching to primarily students coming from a Western perspective, but for young Japanese students watching this film, what was their either perception or changes that you were seeing in this anecdotal your classroom experience?
Now, it's been a few years since I had taught this in my class, but as I recall, I think a lot of people did think it was too long. That was a big thing that a lot of people had said, that it was a little bit
Hmm.
too long. It felt a little bit boring at parts.
Hmm.
Um, and I think kind of like and some said that it was kind of confusing because it's covering, which is understandable because like you said, it does cover a lot of time and there is a lot of history that they go through in this. Um, I feel that Harada did the best probably anyone could do to take all that history from all that such a large period of time and cram it just into 2 hours. I think he did a
Right.
pretty good job doing that. But yeah, I can also see that critique that it can be hard to follow at times. And said when we broke in, and I actually brought up my discussion questions here when I talked about it in class. Um, Unfortunately, I cannot remember exactly what the overall consensus was about this and what they kind of thought about it going into it or what they kind of thought afterwards. But one of my last questions was, do you think it's a pro-war and anti-war? And
Mm.
there were very mixed opinions on that, as I recall.
That makes sense. I mean, this was and it wasn't the defining nature of the discussion in my class, but that's been an aspect of this course is thinking through concepts of what would an anti-war film look like? Are all films that depict war inherently pro-war by the very nature of what is being displayed? We watched films like Kinji Fukasaku's Under the Flag of the Rising Sun. We watched a documentary, The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, that I think make a very strong case for there being some very true anti-war films. But in the case of a picture like The Emperor in August, you do kind of go back to what I think Harada was trying to do of like thread this needle of being able to depict figures that are on one end perhaps viewed only as war criminals and on the other as the representatives making the hardest choice for the security and safety of Japan for decades to come. Because if we look at textbooks that your students probably read, most of them look at Emperor Hirohito as making the sacred decision to end the war, and that he was thinking of peace and thinking of the safety and the prosperity of the millions that one were part of the empire, but then more specifically are defined by the idea of Japanese nationhood and the people that represent that. So it's tricky to watch a film like this made in 2015 and try to nail down how is Harada trying to present the emperor. And I think that I could be you know, engage debates on both ends of it, because we are not given a lot of interiority on the part of the emperor. He appears at specific points and moments. He is given voice in the case of um, uh, Masahiro, but we're not necessarily given a whole lot of the working mechanics of the history of his peace or his warmongering.
Yeah, we don't really know what to make of what he thinks about everything. That's a good point. Another thing that struck me too is I really feel that even though that this was obviously intended to eventually go to an international audience, I think that's why they have all the English subtitles on the title cards and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
But also I feel like this with that even despite that, I feel like Harada's intention was primarily for a Japanese audience, and I think this is where this might be where those people on Letterboxd who said that they thought it was very nationalist come in, because you look at like the depiction of Anami. Again, you've got Koji Yakusho, who's one of the best actors in Japan. He's known for playing these very appealing characters who have a lot of emotional depth and a lot of different range. So you see Anami and you see him as this very kind of conflicted man, right? Who is, yes, he's a patriot, he's a nationalist, but he's also a husband and a father and a grandfather. And you see him, really struggling with these ideas. And I think a lot of people were saying like, oh, they're trying to whitewash this guy who, had he not killed himself, would have definitely been on trial for war crimes. And I think part of the reason why is so that Harada could maybe plant some seeds in the Japanese audience and maybe get them to think about things in a different way. Because if you come out and it's, very harshly anti-war, that can be harder to appeal to the Japanese audiences. So where he does portray these characters as very conflicted, I think it allows people to watch it and, on the one hand, think it's like, oh wow, the emperor made this very difficult decision, and look at Anami, what a great man who was struggling with all this. But then you can also think for a minute like, well, wait a second, there's some other stuff here. And I think with the emperor, it really jumped out to me on this viewing, where the the story of Hirohito's culpability in the war is one that is still up for debate even to this day. Uh, Obviously, the official American position was that Hirohito was basically duped by the militarists and all that, and he was he was basically just like a puppet. And then but then and then there are other sides who say that no, Hirohito was heavily involved in the war planning. He was definitely culpable. He knew what was happening all along. He did nothing to stop it. And as I was watching this last night, it really kind of struck me is that the image that a lot of Japanese nationalists have about the emperor is this idea of, the emperor is descended from the gods and all that. The emperor's will is sacred. It's the most perfect being that exists on the planet. And yet, throughout this movie, people are always undercutting Hirohito, right? I mean, like, there's the when they show Anami the idea about doing an imperial decree. Anami says, "Oh, that's too daring. We're a constitutional monarchy," and the militarists during their coup, when they're planning their coup, they're like, "Look, we have to convince the emperor to change his mind." Well, if he's God, then shouldn't his decision be final? And it's like you're kind of showing your hand there when you're saying things like that. And another thing too is just the portrayal of Hirohito himself, where you know, he's this very soft-spoken guy and he feels very kind of indecisive throughout it. So it I feel like either way you look at this, Hirohito does not really come off in the best light, because either he is this soft, easily, manipulated figure, which completely contradicts the militarist idea of the emperor, or he is this all-powerful god and he's just putting on a show here and letting people dance for him, which makes him look even worse. So it's like, no matter which one you pick, I don't think this really shows him as being this incredible figure.
Yeah, these are the challenging things of again representing these symbols that are, living beings, but then they also take on national symbolic status. Because just like you were saying, I do think though ultranationalists can pull from this whatever they would like to fit their ideology. The emperor being soft-spoken and undercut at this period of time reflects the militarist control of him. And that if only we were to truly restore the emperor to full power, that they could be the divine word that is all-knowing and all-seeing, but that this was, as the title described, this Emperor in August feels like a code word for sort of a flipping, a chaos for the emperor, and not something where they are able to speak with clarity. So if you're this ultra nationalist, you can have this particular view, and then equally on the flip side, by showing humanity in the character of Anami, you are then, again, sort of providing this space where someone who is classified as, would be classified as a war criminal had they not taken their life. uh, it's something that can be then reviled or criticized by people that would be critical of anyone that was in military command in Japan. So no matter how you split it, you're going to have people that will have volatile reactions to them. But the point that you made about having Koji Yakusho in this role assumes a type of authority, and it also assumes a competency and a complexity, because audiences are used to seeing Koji Yakusho in extremely sympathetic, compassionate, and nuanced roles, as recent as something like Perfect Days by Wim Wenders, to some of his very early roles, like a Shall We Dance, or even the frantic detective in Cure by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. So you have this sort of prestige of this character, and that really connects to the first version from 1967, where Toshiro Mifune played General Anami. So you have, I feel like, a little bit of parallel in terms of the stature of the actor that is taking on this role. And both of those actors had also played the commander of the Navy, Admiral Yamamoto. And in the case of Mifune, he played that character like 4 or 5 times over the course of his career. So they have both assumed some of the highest military characters in their own careers. And so they also provide some sort of parallel and uniformity to within the world of filmmaking, the way in which audiences should potentially view these characters, the importance that they had at the time that's being depicted in the film.
Yeah, yeah. And some of the scenes that I think too also kind of add to my idea that I think he's that Harada's trying to sow a little bit of questioning in there is I noticed there's quite a difference between, we see these scenes of like bombed out Tokyo, and a lot of times when we see those, it doesn't feel like it's shown to show the devastation. I mean, we do have some, like, I think the aerial bombings do already show that already, but it's often seems like it's in contrast with the politicians and the militarists and the way they are living at that time too. So like, we
Mm-hmm.
see Tokyo completely leveled, we see people living in shack houses, and we see this very nice car like rolling past it. And
Mm-hmm.
or when we see the Anami's daughter trying to find her way to make her way to the palace, and she finds some, she's doing this walk and she finds some kids digging through the trash, and then she asks them if they know where the way, and they just look at her and they run away. And I feel like there it kind of reminded me of Grave of the Fireflies, where at the end of the movie, we see this really wealthy family move back into their house and like, wow, everything's perfect, everything's fine,
Mm-hmm.
nothing's damaged. And then right nearby, you've got this young kid who just lost his everything. His whole family is gone now. His daughter, his sister has just died, and he has literally nothing else. And it just it that struck out to me, the
Mm-hmm.
sort of class differences that the war caused. So when you hear Hirohito talking about my people are suffering, it rings hollow.
Yeah, well, it's just that, within this film, we're not seeing those depictions because we're in kind of we're truly in a bunker in a lot of scenes with these individuals that have been outside of that. The closest we could, we, like you said, we have images of despair, but it's more at a remove, at a distance. So you're sort of, as an audience member, either having to fill it up with other depictions, books, or other materials that you know of what happened during the war. But within this film, it's again something that's sort of like out of reach, out of touch, because you have General Anami, practicing his bow. You have different things related to more artistic elements. But the one sort of small caveat that's in the narrative is like having the tour of the instruments that they want citizens to use to, in the decisive battle, as they refer to it, that they would use to defend themselves. And you have the images of citizens practicing with bamboo spears, things that have been depicted in other films, but that's maybe our closest depiction of people that are outside of, military officers and obviously the main cabinet.
I do want to talk more about that scene because that scene is always stuck out in my mind Anami looks outside the window and he sees these schoolgirls training with these spears.
Mhm.
Um, and it's just the look on his face and just like the way that when he opens Yakusho is doing a lot of silent acting in this movie, I think. But before
Mhm.
we get too much into that, we're going to go to a break and maybe you'll hear some ads and then we'll come right back.
This is what everyone's talking about.
Everything's on the table.
This is what champions come to take. This is what everyone came to see.
And the slam!
No do-overs. No second chances. No more Mr. Nice Guy. This is winner take all. And it's all happening now on the home of the NBA Finals. Don't miss it. June 3rd on ABC and the ESPN app.
This summer, serve up the Cookout Classics, Heinz Ketchup, and Kraft Singles. Every good burger needs a layer of perfectly melty cheese and thick, rich ketchup. We all know it's not a cookout without Heinz and Kraft.
So right before the break, we were talking about the scene with the schoolgirls who are training with these spears, and it's also in conjunction with this scene of the cabinet touring the weapons that they have to use. And the guy who's giving the tour, he's like almost proud of these weapons as he's showing them off. But then you've got the prime minister who he's just like, what the hell is this? He's like, we have no weapons left. What is this? And then Anami, he just kind of like wanders off and he opens the window. He hears these schoolgirls training outside. He sees them through the windows, which are taped up, and he opens it to get a better look. And we see these girls, like 13, 14, 15, maybe, training how to fight with spears. And there's this look on his face, and it doesn't look like it's a look of pride at what he's doing. It almost feels like, and I feel like this scene is in there to kind of show that just how unrealistic the militarist position had become at this point. And there's another scene too with the chief secretary Sakomizu, who's played by Shinichi Tsutsumi, and he's told that, oh, Japan will win if 20 million citizens go out in kamikaze, and he just looks absolutely terrified by that suggestion. And so I feel like scenes like that are they really stick out to me, and I think that they speak very. It feels like a very powerful moment moment whenever it happens, and I feel like this is Harada, trying to point something out to the audience without drawing too much attention to it.
Right. And that's exactly where there's a damned if you don't quality to a film like this, is that unless you are overt in your politics, the subtlety can, again, bring the criticism from both sides. So I definitely agree that having an actor like Koji Yakusho do subtle, non-verbal, silent movement it's one of the reasons you hire this actor. It's one of the reasons you search for him, that you try to make sure that you can work with him. And again, he has a long established relationship with Harada. He's been in 6, maybe 7 of his feature films over his career. Was a part of all of Harada's major 1990s breakthrough films that were on Kinema Junpo's Best 10. So it's sort of like, old friends kind of getting back together to make another picture. So there's a lot of trust, I think, that's happening with any of the choices that Koji is presenting in a particular sequence. But that scene, like you said, is the subtlety of, oh, we can interpret this potentially as him developing a criticism of the direction that the war is going. And I think that's what speaks to negative criticisms about giving humanity to this character. But it provides, I think, the complexity that a lot of people have, where they're creating a mechanism by which to surrender. The idea that the Japanese Empire would not only not succeed, but that they would become a victim and then defeated nation is so anathema to what the last 15 years has said, that I think that part of the length that maybe your students were criticizing is that I think it took many roundtable discussions to get the minds around the idea that we need some language, we need some stepping stones to get us to the point that we can accept the Potsdam Declaration, because it's not a new concept. There had already been previous uh, calls for the means by which to surrender, but by the time that the Potsdam Declaration is announced in July, we are at this point that we have now had multiple years that Japan's supply routes have been cut off, that the Navy is now decimated, there's no air support or air force. All of the things that make the war machine happen have failed at this point. And so when we are getting down to literally this small cabinet that's just organized since April, since the Yamato has been sunk, you have a group of individuals that are still trying to figure out how can we even have the language to accept this. And that's where you have sequences like Prime Minister Suzuki pointing to the emperor going, he's finally given us the words to accept the surrender. That there has to be a process by which this happens, rather than just, we know logistically, we know and quantifiably we have to surrender. There's more that goes into this.
Yeah. And also another thing on the Emperor too, I think the one scene where I thought that he really came across as having some sort of like feel of authority in it was in the scene with Hojo or Tojo, where sorry, I'm getting it mixed up with Final Fantasy VII there. But when he's talking with Tojo, and Tojo is still trying to make his case, like, no, we can still do this, we can still do this, and he
Right.
brings up this, and Tojo tries to appeal to the Emperor's love of biology, and the Emperor is just like, you motherfucker, what the hell are you talking about? And then he brings up this story of Napoleon, and I love the TV tropes. They called this a moment of shutting up now. And Tojo's just like, okay, yeah, I'm done now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, we open with Tojo. We one of the most, for Western audiences, one of the signifiers of propaganda against Japan during the wartime, along with Hirohito. So to open with that figure is, a striking choice, but also it speaks to, where they were at that point in the war, where he is no longer in power. He's no longer the prime minister. He's been out of the prime ministership for over a year, but still, like many very powerful military and political figures, they still have an immense amount of will and support, and the bending of the ear of many people. So like you're saying, he's trying to play to what he knows of the emperor, what he could potentially sort of acquiesce to. But for him, there's still a stopping point. There's still an end point of where they'll be successful or not. And they just, the idea of kind of creating this alternate reality where, like, by just saying it, by just pushing it, if we commit 20 million soldiers to the fight, we'll win, is that kind of true magical thinking that they're all trying to break out of the spell of. And it's something that I think really does begin with the Admiral Yamamoto's killing in 1943 by U.S. Air Force or naval forces, continues on into the Yamato being sunk, and then obviously things like the firebombing, that they all sort of extend to the point then that the exclamation point of the atomic bomb are all of these sort of, again, on the war part of it, stepping stones to realizing the empire, it has ended. And so the militarists are still even though they're trapped into their mantra, the cracks are starting to show. Like there's not an ability to be able to keep up this lie, or be able to just think that just a little bit more effort and they'll be able to achieve anything. There's more than enough science to say it's over.
And there's also some, and I think this also goes to show just like how ridiculous things have gotten when the cabinet is in this very spirited debate about the wording of the documents, and they just like, and the scene goes on for like, a good while. And they're just
Yep.
shouting back and forth. We can't say it this way. It's like, why can't we say it this way? Well, because this way. And it was just like it it was I don't know, it was just something about that nonsense in that scene just made it so funny, but at the same time also made it horrifying because these guys are so up their asses that while their people are starving and they're suffering, they're dealing with their homes being, bombed to nothing and flattened, and even the militarists too. And I want to talk about this later, but they make the recording, and or they think they're going on the air, and they say, you've been laying on the dirt, and you've been eating, and you've been eating grass, but you can still fight to the death for your country. And I'm just like, you guys are just so disconnected from the reality that people are dealing with. And
Yeah.
it would be funny if it weren't so terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, but the terrifying part is also the word choice that you're talking about, because the words that are used in the Potsdam Declaration, the words that are used by diplomats, also shape the actions that are taking place. And very particularly, it's not depicted in this film that I can recall, but it is depicted in the first film, where you have the prime minister speaking to press corps members, things that would go out in official press releases that would be in response to the Potsdam Declaration. And one word in particular, mokusatsu, or to ignore or not take notice of, was sort of misinterpreted by allies, of that they weren't truly ignoring it, but they weren't going to speak to the Potsdam Declaration. Actually made the allies think more that there was actually, still an intensity of war, and that the need for fighting on the mainland would take place. And it's part of the rationale that's sometimes used to describe the mechanism that led to the atomic bomb being used. So again, something as minute as word choice and the interpretation and translation of it do have some big impact. But within the sphere of the individuals we're looking at, there's all of this attention not only to the words that are being used, but then how it will reflect on the emperor, how it'll reflect on Japan after the war ends. And again, this sort of, I think, lack of ability to believe that the empire could fall is just always sort of right in uh, this sort of oscillation with recognizing the reality in front of them. Like you say, of having this sequence of watching young individuals with bamboo spears, as if that is going to, repel the Allied forces as the Russians come from the north and the U.S. forces come from the south.
Well, also along that line too, and you know, while they're debating all this language and how it's going to reflect on the emperor and all that, I feel like one of the things that this film should have shown is the reaction of the people to the emperor's speech, because one of the things that really surprised me when I read John Dower's book is that the type of Japanese that the emperor was speaking was like this very kind of lofty, imperial, outdated language. And also the fact that he was kind of like mumbling in his speech because he was so soft spoken, and that a lot of people they didn't really know what they were listening to. They didn't really understand what he was saying.
Yeah, I mean, we watched another film released in the mid 1980s by Masahiro Shinoda, called in English it's called MacArthur's Children, and it depicts young school children listening to the address as the very opening of the film, and one of the kids leaned to the other, going like, "What's he talking about? What's he saying?" Like they just could not comprehend it, and even the emperor himself, because you mentioned that you had read James Toland's book, that uh, the emperor had to redo the recording. So there's an original recording where he has a flub and they had to re-record it. And he even missed a character in the second recording that is the official recording, but they thought it would be too much effort to have the emperor read it a third time. And there had also been edits to it. There were, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 characters, the full speech. And rather than retype it out to correct, they had to like do early post-it notes over it to, again, get it into the form that they were going to have. But like you mentioned, it's such an abstracted Japanese that, again, only the emperor could speak in this language, so, instead of like Watashi using Chin as this, sort of royal we, are all things that, again, go back to word choice, but also speak to the way in which, if the emperor is going to speak to the nation, how is the emperor going to present themselves? Because again, everyday people don't hear the emperor speak. That wasn't something that was, that's a post-war development to have this reshaping of the emperor. And that's again an aspect that goes into us seeing an actual actor depict Hirohito, not have him obscured. We've needed the length of time, we've needed the death of Hirohito to also play a part in depicting this individual and rethinking their role during the wartime. And that actually goes to, you were talking about how in the early 2000s there was visual film representations of Hirohito starting to happen. But in the early 1990s, after his death in 1989, there was more of a nationwide reassessing of the Showa period, of what the emperor's culpability in the war was. Norma Field wrote a book around that time, kind of again, the emperor, but thinking about the way in which the death of the emperor reshapes some of the thinking of the country at that time. A professor here at Portland State University, Professor Ken Ruoff, his career is built around a study of the imperial family and has written 3 monographs on the imperial family and the way in which the post-war has reshaped the conversation we're having right now about the choice that the emperor makes, and whether that was something that, really was the narrative of the post-war, or maybe something a bit more complex, that it's not just that the emperor was a pacifist and only seeking peace for the 15 years that there was a warring nation, but really was much more nuanced than what we'd like to think of as a neat and tidy pacifist that has the Midori no Hi environmental day.
Yeah. Also too, one of the things that really stuck out to me is in a subtle way how in that the revolution is really kind of showcases, or the failed revolution, it showcases just kind of what heroes the civil servants in Japan are. And even to this day, like, people complain about Japanese bureaucracy, but honestly, like having dealt with people at City Hall, these people are especially, comparing to like the people I've dealt with, like in American civil services and that kind of stuff, it's night and day. Like the people down at City Hall in Japan, no matter where I've been, like here in Kagoshima or when I lived in Ehime, like it's just, they are the most helpful people that you would ever imagine. And they just go out of their way to try and make sure that you get your situation resolved. Like I've never had a situation where like, well, we can't help you. You have to go away. Whereas that would
Right.
happen all the time in like an American context. And so when we see them here, when they're they're hiding the speech and so that the militarists can't get to it, or when they pretend that the radio broadcast is running when it's really not, so they're just speaking to
Mhm.
dead air. And like I thought that was very well done too, and it's something that really kind of stuck out to me on reviewings of this movie.
Yeah, and again, this connects to things like Dower's book and Toland's book, is that even the efforts that they were making while there was violence, the disruption they were having and the munitions they had left were so paltry that it was a failure to begin with. Like there really wasn't an apparatus for there to be a successful coup. Less successful than even the failed coup of 36. Where you don't have the means anymore. It really is just sort of a last gasp, a last desperation. The sound of like a grenade exploding, near the palace was so paltry compared to the bombing rates that had been going on incessantly for months that again, the actions of these militarists just feels like this last small breath, even if there is, true violence that took place at the time. So depicting like speaking to dead air and, having them ultimately either committing seppuku or committing suicide by a gun, is that kind of final act of people that would fall under the umbrella of the militarists.
Those are kind of the main things that really stood out to me. What were some other
Mhm.
things that you wanted that really kind of jumped out at you?
Well, I was kind of wanting to ask you a little bit about what you thought of the film style. You were mentioning sort of maybe the color that was being used or the way that different scenes were being depicted. But as a film, what were some of the scenes that stood out to you? Because for me, I feel like it's like a contrast where there are certain sequences that feel very lush, well composed. There's an attention to detail, and then there's others where it almost feels like a television drama where like the sets feel a little bit sparse, that there's just not much in terms of money on the screen that's really being utilized. And I felt like again at different points in the film there I was seeing almost like two different approaches to how this film should be depicted. And it reminded me a little bit of how later films by Koji Wakamatsu, who had started off in softcore pornographic films, but made more political films in the latter part of his career, like Caterpillar and a film about Mishima Yukio, that are basically digital video films that really are almost no budget. There were aspects of this film that, certain scenes that felt that way to me. So I was kind of curious how you felt, like filmically, how this picture sort of hit you.
I felt it really did a good job of conveying the different types of environments that these different scenes take place in. So when you've got these outdoor scenes and you're kind of seeing like this, the like the car driving through the sakura
Right.
petals falling down, like it's just that's just like that was one that really jumped out at me. Um, or like before when I said that you see the very kind of like drab, colorless, flattened Tokyo, and you see this really nice, expensive car rolling through there past a shack like that. That really kind of helped showcase to me, and that was one of those things that really kind of jumped out at me, is showing this difference of how war is affecting regular people versus how it is affecting the elites who are prolonging the war. Um,
Yeah.
but at the same time, then you also have I almost thought it was kind of funny where we see I'm pretty sure it was Anami where he goes from one room into another, and the room it's just like it's just a basic tatami room, and it's got a desk sitting there right in the middle of it, and that's it. And it just
Right.
felt it felt almost funny to me. It's like, why even bother? Why not just keep the desk in the other room then? So
Right.
where
Right.
he gets
Right.
out, he puts on his slippers, walks over to the next room, takes off his slippers again, gets in, there's just a desk there, and that's it. Like
Hmm.
it felt oddly humorous to me to see that. And I don't know, I don't know if there's any sort of message in there. I don't know if that was just like, well, that's just the way they did things back then. And yeah, it does seem a little bit weird when you think about it. Um, but also you had the bunker scenes where everything felt very kind of claustrophobic, and it's very dark and everything. And and I think and one of the things that interested me about it is, going to the filmic aspect of it, is that even though it is a long movie, and a lot of people have said, oh, it's too long, it's boring. I honestly thought like he did a very good job of making these talky scenes, because the movie is basically just, you know, I mean, the last 30 minutes is when we got the coup stuff in there, but there's not a whole lot of direct action in the coup. Like
Right.
it is mostly just a movie of people talking at each other for an hour and a half or so.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the same kind of question that I give to my students, not so much of like, is it boring or not, but more when we think of like structure and pacing, like, are there things that are, keeping you engaged, or are things that allow you to kind of, fall out of the film? So again, I bring up the comparison, the structure of the film from 1967 gets us to August 14th by the 20th minute. We don't get to August 14th in this film until the midway point. And so the longest day is half of this film. And that right there, I think also creates just a really interesting way of thinking of how Harada was, again, trying to think about what's important for my audience to be able to understand this, because we don't have like a depiction of the Yamato being sunk. We have a depiction of the forming of this new cabinet. So right there, like you're saying, we're going to be staying with people that are talking. We're going to hear about a lot of events. We're only going to see a handful. We're going to have one sequence where a building is burning and a few long shots to depict the Tokyo fire bombings. We're going to have a single, rather crude CGI representation of the Hiroshima bombing, but we're not going to depict the bombing of Nagasaki. We're going to be in the cabinet as they get the news that the second bomb has been dropped. So the choices of what's shown and what is not, I think, are also, an interesting factor with this film when we have more recent depictions like Oppenheimer that are, again, looking at a very similar point in history, but for very, very different aims, very, very different goals. And so, again, to me, it's not so much good and bad. It's more thinking of, again, at this point in time, who is this film for? And so I think that'd be a question I'd have for you is like, who do you think the audience for this film was, either in the mind of the filmmakers or as you're watching it? Like, who would best be able to receive this movie? It's most useful to watch right now?
So I actually have this interview I have with Harada is I feel like, and this is kind of cheating here, but I think he basically lays it out here. And he says, when I was in high school, the teachers just skipped over contemporary history, the war, and its aftermath. In the mid-70s, people were worried that the college kids then didn't even know America and Japan had fought a war. Well, those kids are now the mothers, fathers, and teachers of today's generation, and they don't seem to care about what direction Japan will take. With the Abe administration lowering the age of voting, it's time for voting Japanese to start thinking about how this country was made. For young Japanese, think about how this country was made. I hope this film will become one turning point for them to start thinking about where they came from and where they're going. So I think that answers the question. As I think, and I think shows the conundrum with my students who are all very young, which when they looked at it and they thought it was too boring and they thought it was too long. And so I think, but at the same time, and so there is an aspect of it where I mean he's trying to I think his intended audience was these young people, and that's why he has all this history in there, right? I mean, there's a scene early on when someone says to Suzuki, he's like, "Oh, you serve with the emperor and all this," and it's like, well, yeah, Suzuki would know that, right? That's the whole "as you know" trope thing coming in, and that's obviously just there for the audience. Right. And any history buffs would also know that who are watching this film. So I think what happened is Harada was trying to put all this information in there, and he's trying to gloss over the stuff that he assumes that these young people already know. So things like the atomic bomb is well-worn territory in Japan. Things like the sinking of the Yamato, also, well-worn territory. Nagasaki as well. We can just skip that altogether. And, but the firebombing of Tokyo, we can just rely on the stock footage here and have like one scene of it, and we'll shoot that for a day and spend a bit of money on it, but then we don't have to go to the effort of doing the whole big thing. But so I think his whole idea is he's like, I'm trying to focus on the things that I think people don't know about this type of history, which, and to speak about the Hiroshima scene too with that, because the narrative, especially in the West, usually is, oh, so there was the Hiroshima bomb, and then and then nothing happened, and then the Nagasaki bomb happened, and then everything stopped. And it's like you're watching this movie and you get to Hiroshima, and if you pause, you're like, wait a second, there's still like an hour and a half left in this movie.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's also, again, I think the argument and why it's wonderful that we have the 67 film also is that it makes the argument of what you're saying. Like, do you load a film up with history? Is it meant to be a history text? Well, in that case, I think that there could be a criticism that you're skipping over the very history that would then provide the interest in what these debates are that are happening in the second half of the film. Or if you're most interested in things that are less, well known or discussed, because again, like I was mentioning, when you look at a Japanese history textbook, that's a, from the origin story to contemporary times, you get basically two sentences for almost every major incident. So you're skipping right over and just going with the narrative of the emperor wants peace. So to do something that's more calculated, more sort of working through it, do you maybe need to actually spend more time just on that day? And then have more sequences where we learn about who these individuals are. We have different scenes that can depict the way in which the military apparatus functions. Because again, like you said, there's a degree of shorthand. You kind of have to have a teensy bit of knowledge because there's not a lot that tells you who Hideki Tojo is, other than he's someone that's yelling and not necessarily wanting to accept the Potsdam Declaration. We don't really have a full sense of him being, head of the army, being a prime minister. We don't get a ton of that. So what is then the value of doing like kind of quick roughshod to the midpoint of the film? Like this to me is where, I could kind of argue both ways, but I think just like you're saying, when you have my students, your students, I think deal with the length, deal with this, that, and the other. If there aren't things that really are providing that history, this can just again feel like history class the movie, and critically it didn't have exceptionally high marks. It didn't break box office records. It sort of had its time in 2015 and then just sort of went away. So it feels like even the intentionality of the film, is sort of lost a little bit, and that's why like I actually am like really pleased though that there is a home video version of this. Like you said, you found it at your local video store, and here in the Portland area, we're fortunate to have a place like Movie Madness that is a regional sort of hub of rental video, and they have the out of print Twilight Time Blu-ray that includes some special features, even includes an isolated score soundtrack, so you can watch this without any dialogue and just listen to the score through the film. That's one of the features of Twilight Time. But again, it goes back to thinking of like how this film's structured, and I kind of waffle a little bit of like for people like ourselves, we bring a vested interest to this subject matter, to Japanese cinema. But for the average film goer, I just don't know how they're going to take it.
No, I think, yeah. So I feel like, yeah. So yeah, I think Harada had this idea of who this film was for, but I don't think the film was made with those people necessarily in mind, and like the perspective that he'd need to give them to engage them. And I think part of it too is just the sheer wealth of information that you have to cover. So I wonder if maybe something like this would have been better served by being like a mini series or something like
Right.
that, where
Yeah.
maybe then you could have had a little bit more stuff about, okay, so who is Tojo? Well, we can find a way to introduce Tojo a little bit, more organically, and so that people would understand him. Maybe have some more stuff with the reactions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Maybe open up with the sinking of the Yamato and all that, and have something dramatic that can grab people right from the start of the first episode. So I think that he, again, I enjoy it, and I do think, but I also understand the criticisms. And I also, to the pacing thing, like we are talking about some of the scenes when they're transitioning from one place to another, they're nice, I think, because, we do get to see the landscapes of the time. Harada does a really good job shooting them and really kind of makes it feel like you're in that period. It also does help show the kind of rich poor divide that was happening in Japan at the end of the war. But at the same time, maybe we could have trimmed some of those for time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and as I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking of how, whether it's stated in that interview that you referenced, or it's just something that I'm coming with, but this film is not being made in a vacuum. There are a number of films looking at the Pacific War, at the 15 Years War in the 21st century that are being made in somewhat conversation with this film. So you have, a picture like Yamato by the Kadokawa Corporation 2005. You have uh Shintaro Ishihara's film For Those We Love about kamikaze pilots. You have Takashi Yamazaki's The Eternal Zero that comes out in 2013. The battle or the was it something the Archimedes that looks at the development of the Yamato battleship. You have The Wind
Didn't the Wind
Rises
Rises?
from
Yeah,
Studio Ghibli. All of these films are right in the pocket of Harada thinking, it'd be interesting to take another crack at, a World War II film, because this is not his first time, delving into material of this period of time, but this is the first time he's looking at these military figures in this way. So it's almost like, again, as audience members, you can't just go and see the one film. You almost have to be in dialogue with all of these other films that have come out, so that then, like we're talking about, there is a sense of looking at history that's less discussed, less well known in a contemporary period, even if we go back 50, 60 years to, the first iterations or other war films that were being released in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Like Harada's pointing out, there's another generation, and there's an emphasis to want to again, rethink these stories, rethink the way we can think about history and how young individuals might need to remember this period of time.
Yeah, I think that's becoming very clear now, especially when we're seeing the return of a lot of the ultra nationalist rhetoric, like
Yes.
the Sanseito Party coming up. Takaichi's very much in that vein, and like trying to do whatever she can to court to those people. So
Right.
I think, and also when you look at movies like Godzilla -1, which I mean, I personally think was a stunning indictment of the kamikaze and their ethos, and of the Japanese government at the time, which is, and I haven't seen Eternal Zero, but my understanding is that movie was actually very pro kamikaze, or so I was very kind of confused by that.
Yeah, I actually I kind of have the opposite view of you with Godzilla -1. I think that there is a lot of work being done to present the argument that you're making. I think that there's a very competent reading of what you were saying, but I think equally there is an attention to this spirit of the Yamato that exists in the Eternal Zero. That the whole nature of that narrative is about a Zero fighter that doesn't want to die, that wants to live, that wants to preserve themselves, but ultimately goes on a suicide mission to help their friend. And so it's sort of trying to play both sides simultaneously. And I think at its heart, there is still this emphasis on dying for your country, being something to be respected and loved, and a deep seated patriotism. But Yamazaki is extremely skilled at creating very heart wrenching narratives. And that is reflected in his Always trilogy that came out in the early aughts to I think 2012. That he is very good at writing stories that feel saccharine and can pull at your heart. And that's part of why Godzilla -1 was so successful. It's one of the first Godzilla films to really have intense characterizations of individuals, maybe since the first film. But yeah, focusing on these soldiers. But part of the Godzilla -1 ethos does seem like these soldiers like need something to die for. Had they not messed up the war, we would have been able to die gloriously. But instead, we're this defeated nation. So here is our attempt now with this monster coming to Tokyo, where we can fulfill the goals of the empire in the post-war period. But I know there's a lot of other conversations happening on the outside of it. But there's still this, at the heart of it, a goal for a suicide mission for a larger purpose that sort of sits at the center of it. And that is kind of a through line in this director's filmography. And so again, I don't know if Yamazaki himself has certain intentions in his heart and mind, but I do know that The Eternal Zero was written by an ultra nationalist. So there's there are these elements at play. That the type of person that denies that comfort women existed, that basically thinks that the rape of Nanking was again a hoax, and is basically propaganda against the Empire of Japan, and that sort of filters into not the director themselves, but the corollary material that they're working on.
Right. That's really interesting about The Eternal Zero. like when I first heard about it, I had zero interest in it, and then after I saw Godzilla minus one, um and then I started getting curious about it. I'm just like, how did my view of of what Eternal Zero, what it was in my head compared to what I took out of Godzilla minus one, made by the same director, those two things just did not compute in my head. So
Right.
based on what you just said there, I'm very interested to take a look at it, and maybe also take another look at Godzilla one more time. I think I still disagree with you about Godzilla minus one though, but that's
Well,
a
yeah, I
discussion
mean,
for another time.
right. See, this is the beauty and the horror of talking about this period of time and anything that depicts the immediate post-war is that there's any number of factors that can lead you down one path or suggest to you the intentionality of a filmmaker. And I try not to do too much of like what the director thinks. I feel like you get into an authorial trap there. But
Yeah.
that was sort of part of the takeaway I had in watching the film. It doesn't take away from the enjoyment or it being an entertaining film. There's immense reasons that was a successful film. There's going to be a sequel to it. So all of those are, and it just provides nice fodder for us to debate and talk about, and just more movies to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if I stopped watching every movie I politically disagreed with, I actually like a lot of propaganda stuff. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
uh,
this is the struggle, but
mhm,
it's the joy of being able to engage in artistic works.
exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it's a good note to end on with The Emperor in
Mhm,
August. I mean, I think in summation, if you know the history, it's, I think you'll definitely get a lot more out of it.
mhm.
But even if you don't, go in just knowing that it is a very talky movie. It does move at a certain pace. So if you're okay with that, then I think there's some really interesting stuff to take away from it, especially when you um when you focus on like the characters and what they're going through. And I think it makes for there were some really interesting questions that come out of this as a result of watching it. And it really made me, rethink some of my beliefs about the war, and re-examine some of those things. I know after I talked about it with my students, it made them think about it in different ways as well. So I think that's ultimately, I think that whether or not it did what he thought it was going to do, because like you said, obviously it wasn't this big movie that started a revolution in young people getting taking an interest in politics, but it's still worth a watch, and I think there's still some interesting things to take away from it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, and also there's just such a competency in the crew, but also the individuals in front of the camera. I mean, this is a late role for Tsutomu Yamazaki. This is right in the pocket for Koji Yakusho. These are actors that even if the film itself doesn't work for you, it provides a context for understanding the careers of these individuals that really are some of the best representations of Japanese film acting.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. All right. Well, Patrick, thanks so much for coming on. Is there anything you would like to promote or direct people before we wrap up?
Well, I mean, again, I teach courses regularly on Japanese cinema studies in the Pacific Northwest area. So if you're in the Portland area, I sometimes give public talks at OMSI here at Portland State, teaching courses, and always looking for opportunities to communicate about Japanese cinema and about film history. So anyone that wants to connect with me can reach out to my email that I can supply you with for the link. And really, it's just been a pleasure speaking with you again, Perry.
Yes, as well. Let's not let another few more years pass before we have you back on the show. But
Agreed.
yeah, we'll have that link in the show notes. So people, please make sure to reach out to Patrick if you'd like to talk more about this kind of stuff or find out about any of his classes or anything like that. As for us, japanonfilm.com is the website. We are japanonfilm.com on Blue Sky, Japan on Film on all the other socials, but Blue Sky's where I hang out the most if I hang out. But if you do want to connect in a little bit more personalized environment, we do have the Film Stories Podcast Network, which has its own Discord. You can find an invite link to that, and there is a channel specifically for Japan on Film on there. So you can go over there if you want to talk about Japanese movies. We drop in from time to time. It's probably the least active channel on the Discord, to be honest, but it's there. So, and I do check in from time to time. So if you have any questions or anything like that, you can post up on there and I will get to it eventually. And also, please make sure to check out the Film Stories Podcast Network, see what other shows are coming up next. And thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.